You smell it before you understand what it means. A sweetness that shouldn't exist in spring air, mingling with incense that can't mask what lies beneath. You're standing in a stone corridor where servants draw lots like condemned men, and the ones who lose begin to weep. Through the heavy door ahead comes a sound that makes your blood stop, not a scream of fear, but something worse. The howl of someone whose body has turned traitor, whose flesh is consuming itself, while consciousness remains to witness every moment. You don't know it yet, but you're about to enter a room where a queen is dying in a way that defies every mercy God is supposed to grant the dying. Where the womb that birthed emperors has become a tomb crawling with life that shouldn't be there. Before we descend into that chamber, I have to know where in the world are you watching this from. It genuinely moves me that a story this dark, this buried in the shadows of the 16th century, can reach someone wherever you are right now. That connection across time still amazes me. The year is 1555, and in the fortress palace of Tordesillas, along the Duero River in the heart of Castile, something is happening that court physicians will struggle to document without their hands shaking. The woman in that sealed room is 75 years old, though what disease and decades have done to her makes age meaningless. She is Joanna of Castile, daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand, the Catholic monarchs, who unified Spain and sent Columbus across an unknown ocean. She is mother to Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful man in Christendom, ruler of an empire stretching from Spain to Austria, from the Netherlands to the New World. She has been Queen of Castile for 51 years, and for 46 of those years she has been a prisoner. The servants who must attend her chamber have developed a ritual born of desperation. They soak strips of linen in vinegar and bind them across their faces before entering. They burn frankincense and myrrh in braziers until the air grows thick with holy smoke. None of it helps. The smell that emanates from the queen's body has a physical presence, a weight that seems to press against your chest and coat your throat. Fresh flowers placed at dawn are brown and wilted by midday, as if the very atmosphere in that room accelerates decay. The stones of the walls have begun to show dark stains of moisture, as though the building itself is sweating out the horror it contains. But to understand how Joanna came to die, this way how a woman born to the highest privilege could end her days with her body rotting from the inside. While she remained conscious, we must travel back more than half a century, to when she represented not suffering, but hope. She was born in 1479 in Toledo, third child of two monarchs whose marriage had ended generations of civil war. Young Joanna grew up in a court that valued both piety and intellect, studying Latin, philosophy, music, and dance. Contemporary accounts describe her as brilliant, particularly gifted with languages, possessing a beauty that combined her mother's fierce intelligence with her father's calculating political mind. She was raised knowing that her body and her womb belonged not to herself but to the diplomatic machinery of European power. Princesses were treaties written in flesh. She accepted this with the quiet resignation expected of a girl who would likely never rule in her own right. In 1496, when Joanna was 16, her parents engineered a double marriage alliance with the House of Habsburg, the most powerful dynasty in Europe. Joanna would marry Philip, Duke of Burgundy, son of the Holy Roman Emperor. The arrangement would encircle France, Spain's great rival, with Habsburg territories. That August, Joanna set sail from Laredo with a fleet carrying her dowry and over 100 attendants. Storms battered them for weeks. Several ships were lost. When she finally reached the Netherlands, exhausted and terrified, she had no idea that the true storm was just beginning. Philip of Burgundy was 18. impossibly beautiful, and knew it. They called him Philip the Handsome, and portraits show wide, delicate features, golden hair, an expression of aristocratic ease. When Joanna first saw him, something unprecedented happened in the careful machinery of arranged royal marriages. She fell desperately, consuming in love. Not the polite affection expected of political unions, but an obsessive passion that would define and destroy everything that followed. For Philip, raised in the sophisticated, pleasure-seeking Burgundian court, his Spanish bride was exotic and interesting for a time. The marriage was consummated with such enthusiasm that chroniclers noted how the formal ceremonies were rushed through. Joanna bore him a daughter, Eleanor, in 1498. For a brief window, she knew something like happiness. But Philip kept mistresses, many of them openly. This was expected behavior for a prince in Burgundian court culture. But Joanne, raised in the austere moral environment of Isabella's Spain, found it intolerable. Her love curdled into jealous obsession. She reportedly attacked one of Philip's mistresses with scissors, cutting off the woman's hair in a fit of rage. Courtiers began to whisper. The Spanish princess was unstable, prone to violent outbursts and strange silences. Philip, rather than attempting to understand, used these incidents to marginalize her, painting her as mentally unfit even as he exploited her royal bloodline for political advantage. Then death began to hunt the Spanish succession with methodical precision. In 1497, Joanna's brother Juan, heir to the unified throne, died suddenly at 19. His pregnant widow miscarried. The succession passed to Joanna's older sister Isabella, Queen of Portugal. Within a year, Isabella died in childbirth. Her son Miguel lived only 2 years. Through this cascade of mortality, Joanna was transformed from a minor princess into heir presumptive to Spain. She was now the link between the Spanish kingdoms and the vast Habsburg Empire, making her the most valuable royal woman in Europe. Philip understood immediately what this meant. Through his wife, he could claim the Spanish crowns. His treatment of Joanna grew more calculating, more cruel. When she protested his infidelities, he had her confined to her chambers for weeks at a time. She began to exhibit behaviors that would haunt her, forever refusing to change clothes, stopping attendance at Mass, spending hours staring in silence. Modern psychology recognizes these as symptoms of severe depression, possibly complicated by postpartum trauma from multiple pregnancies. But in the early 16th century, such behaviors were interpreted as madness, particularly in a woman. In November 1504, Queen Isabella died, worn out by illness and worry. Her death left Joanna as rightful Queen of Castile. Isabella's will tried to protect her daughter, naming Joanna's father Ferdinand as regent if Joanna was unwilling or unable to rule a carefully worded provision that acknowledged trouble without declaring incapacity. But Philip immediately declared himself King of Castile by right of marriage. He and Joanna returned to Spain in 1506 with an army. Ferdinand, facing civil war, reluctantly recognized them as co-monarchs and withdrew to Aragon. Joanna should have been celebrating her accession. Instead, she was a puppet in her husband's political theater, paraded before the Cortes when needed, confined when not. Then, in September 1506, Philip played Pilata in the heat and fell suddenly ill. Within days, doctors diagnosed typhoid fever. Some whispered poison. As Philip lay dying in Burgos, delirious and sweating, Joanna remained by his bedside, refusing food and sleep. She held his hand as he drew his last breath on September 25th. Then she sat beside his corpse for hours, unable to accept that the man she had loved with such destroying passion was gone. What happened next became legend. Joanna refused to allow Philip's burial. She had his coffin opened repeatedly to gaze upon his decomposing features, sometimes embracing the corpse. She ordered a funeral procession to move his body from Burgos to Granada, where Spanish monarchs were traditionally interred. But the journey became an endless, nightmarish wandering. They traveled only at night. Joanna declared she couldn't bear the sun to shine on Philip's coffin. When they stopped at a convent, she flew into a rage upon learning nuns resided there, screaming that no women should come near her husband's body, even in death. The coffin was opened again and again, releasing waves of putrid stench. Monks who witnessed these scenes described a queen who seemed possessed, her hair wild, her clothing stained, her eyes burning with unnatural intensity. All the while, she was pregnant with Philip's final child. In March 1507, at Torquemada, Joanna gave birth to a daughter, Catherine, in a convent beside Philip's coffin. The room reeked of decay. Joanna's own hygiene had deteriorated so badly that midwives struggled to assist her. After the birth, Ferdinand intervened decisively. He took control of Castile as regent, moved Joanna and Philip's body to Tordesillas, and had Philip finally interred in the nearby convent of Santa Clara. Joanna, Ferdinand explained, would rest and recover there. She was 27 years old. She would remain in Tordesillas for the next 46 years until her death. She was told she was being cared for. In truth, she had been imprisoned. The early years of captivity saw continued deterioration. Ferdinand, ruling as regent, maintained that his daughter was incapable of governing. Documents describe days of complete silence, followed by violent outbursts, refusal to eat for weeks, obsessive insistence that Philip was still alive. She kept his portrait, speaking to it for hours. Her attendants recorded everything, creating documentation that justified her imprisonment. Whether Joanna was genuinely suffering severe mental illness, or whether her symptoms were exaggerated by those who benefited from her incapacity, remains debated. The truth likely lies between real psychological trauma, exploited and worsened by captivity. When Ferdinand died in 1516, Joanna's son Charles raised in the Netherlands. Barely knowing his mother, became King of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor. He traveled to Tordesillas, hoping she would formally recognize him as king. The encounter was awkward and painful. Charles, 16 and speaking no Spanish, faced a woman who was legally Queen of Castile, but existed in twilight captivity. Joanna showed moments of lucidity, asking about his siblings, expressing concern for his welfare. But she refused to sign documents transferring power. Perhaps she understood that doing so would admit her own incapacity. Charles left troubled, but took no action to free her. Like his grandfather before him, he found Joanna's imprisonment politically convenient. Her legal status as queen gave legitimacy to his rule, while her incapacity prevented her from challenging his authority. The years ground forward with crushing monotony. Joanna's world contracted to a few rooms. She was attended by servants who reported her every action. Her youngest daughter, Catherine, remained with her for several years. One of the few bright moments in that darkness, accounts suggest Joanna was loving, even doting, when lucid, teaching Catherine Latin and music. But Catherine was eventually taken away to be raised properly at court. Joanna was alone again. In 1520, the Camineiros' revolt briefly disrupted her captivity. Rebels captured Tordesillas and tried to use Joanna as a figurehead. presenting documents for her to sign that would legitimize their cause. It was a moment of extraordinary possibility. She could have reclaimed her throne. Witnesses describe a woman who seemed to understand, who asked intelligent questions. Some historians see evidence here that Joanna had never been as mad as claimed, but whether from confusion, maternal loyalty, or shrewd calculation, she refused to sign. The revolt was crushed. Her confinement became even more severe. She had missed her chance, if it had ever truly existed. The decades passed. As Charles's empire expanded across the Americas, as the Protestant Reformation tore Europe apart, as Spain became Christendom's dominant power, the woman who was legally Queen of Castile sat in Tordesillas, aging invisibly. She stopped attending Mass. She developed obsessive rituals around food, sometimes refusing to eat for days, then gorging. Her hygiene deteriorated further. She refused to change clothes or bathe, and servants had to wait until she slept to clean her or alter her garments. These behaviors, documented meticulously, reinforced the narrative of madness. But they also suggest a woman exercising the only control she had left over her own body in defiance of those who controlled everything else. By the 1540s, Joanna was in her 60s, ancient by 16th century standards. Decades of poor diet, lack of exercise, and psychological torment had ravaged her. Reports describe a skeletal woman, haggard and worn, her hair matted and tangled, her teeth rotted and fallen out, making eating difficult and painful. She suffered from severe arthritis, digestive problems, the accumulated damage of a life lived in captivity. And then, sometime in the early 1550s, the horror that would define her legend began. The symptoms started subtly. Irregular bleeding, which in a woman her age might not seem immediately alarming, but the bleeding continued, became profuse, accompanied by cramping pains that left her gasping. And then an odor began, foul and sickly sweet, the unmistakable smell of infected necrotic flesh. Her attendants, already reluctant to approach closely, now found their duty almost unbearable. They would stand at her threshold, calling from a distance, avoiding physical contact whenever possible. The physicians summoned to examine her faced an impossible task. Medical understanding of gynecological conditions in the 16th century was primitive and often fatally wrong. Female anatomy was poorly understood. Moreover, examining a queen intimately was fraught with protocol and danger. The doctors worked through servants, relying on second-hand descriptions. When they did examine her directly, they did so with extraordinary haste. What they reported to Charles's court was alarming. The queen suffered from an infection deep within the womb, possibly from retained tissue from her last pregnancy nearly 50 years earlier, perhaps a tumor turned cancerous, possibly an injury that never healed. The infection was spreading. There was little they could do. Treatment options were barbaric and ineffective. They attempted douches of wine, vinegar, honey, and herbs forced into the vaginal canal-agonizing procedures that only worsened the inflammation. They prescribed bleeding, opening her veins to let out bad humors, which weakened her further. They applied hot compresses meant to draw out infection, but which only intensified her pain. Nothing worked. The infection continued its remorseless progression, eating away tissue, spreading poison through her body. Joanna developed a constant fever that would spike unpredictably into delirium. The pain became so severe she could no longer walk, confined now not just by political imprisonment, but by physical incapacity. As weeks became months, the true horror became apparent. The infection wasn't simply killing her, It was causing her body to rot from the inside while she remained conscious and aware. The discharge from her womb became increasingly foul dark blood mixed with pus and fragments of dead tissue. The smell intensified beyond anything human experience should contain, penetrating every fabric, every corner of her chamber. Fresh flowers brought each morning were brown and wilted by midday. Incense burned constantly but couldn't mask the underlying stench. Servants who attended her would emerge retching, their clothes reeking so badly they burned them rather than attempt washing. The stone walls showed dark stains, as if the rot were leaching into the building itself. The nights were worst. In darkness, as fever scrambled her thoughts, Joanna would scream. Not shouts of delirium, but wails of pure agony sounds. Witnesses struggled to describe, inhuman, tortured, the voice of someone experiencing suffering beyond language's capacity to express. The screams echoed through palace corridors, penetrating even thick stone. Servants sleeping in distant rooms would wake in terror. Guards stationed outside would cross themselves and pray. Townspeople of Tordesillas, hearing those distant cries on the night wind, hurried past the palace walls. Stories spread the Mad Queen was being tortured by demons, or transforming into something not quite human, or being punished by God for unnamed sins. The screaming would continue for hours until exhaustion or unconsciousness finally granted respite. It was during one of these nighttime episodes that a servant named Maria Gonzalez witnessed something that would haunt her forever. Summoned to change blood-soaked linens, she worked quickly, trying to minimize exposure to the stench. Then she noticed movement in the soiled cloths she'd just removed. In the candlelight, she saw them, small, pale worms writhing in the bloody discharge. The linens were alive with them, dozens of larvae feeding on the necrotic tissue sloughing away from Joanna's rotting womb. Gonzalez dropped the linens and fled the chamber, hysterical, crossing herself repeatedly, crying that the queen was being devoured from within while she still lived. What Gonzalez had witnessed was meiosis, the infestation of living tissue by fly larvae. In warm weather, flies attracted to the smell of infection would have entered through windows, laying eggs in the discharge and dead tissue. These eggs hatched into the larvae she saw. In modern understanding, certain maggots actually help clean wounds by consuming dead tissue while leaving healthy flesh untouched. But in 1555, in the fevered imagination of Counter-Reformation Spain, these worms took on demonic significance. They were seen as evidence of corruption in both physical and spiritual sensa, visible manifestation of rot that went beyond the merely bodily. Word of the worms spread, despite attempts at secrecy. The story grew with each telling. Some claimed the worms were as large as snakes, that they crawled from the queen's body and had to be gathered in buckets, that they spoke with demonic voices. Letters sent from Tordesillas to Charles's court mentioned the queen's monstrous affliction and unnatural suffering. In a culture steeped in religious symbolism, people sought spiritual meaning in physical horror. Joanna's rotting womb was interpreted as divine commentary on her marriage, on her supposed madness, on the cursed nature of her bloodline.